morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much. We have your attention for the next 40 minutes. My name is Sten-Kristian Saluveer. I'm very excited and very happy to moderate this opening session for Latitude59. And what could be even more amazing to have two extraordinary panelists with us sharing their thoughts. President Kersti Kaljulaid, she served as the President of the Republic of Estonia from 2016 to 21, and during her time in office, she made her presence felt both her homeland and the international era. Coming from the startup community, I have to say that that time was extraordinary. Not only we achieved tremendous things with e-residency, but also the Estonian startup sector actually went to grow unprecedented amounts. Over the years, President Kaljulaid has also robustly defended our society's principles: democracy, human rights, equal treatment, and freedom of speech. And she has said herself that I am never silent when our security is in question, when our freedoms are at stake, or when those weaker than us are treated unjustly. In summer 2021, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed her to the position of Global Advocate for Every Woman, Every Child strategy on the health and well-being of women, children, and adolescents worldwide. And about those topics we are going to talk as well. Our second panelist today is Korski. Congratulations, you are running for the Mayor of London.
I thought it was time for an entrepreneur to take the job.
Yeah. But
come on, give him an applause for that disruption in politics.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Exactly, and he co-founded and is the CEO of Public. Public helps to reimagine and build digitally enabled public services and become a leading European government-focused technology company. He has 20 years of experience in senior positions of government across the UK, EU, and US, and he was recently at the Deputy Head of Policy at number 10 at Downing Street. So you are very familiar with London indeed. All right, let's start from the bigger picture. The World Economic Forum in the beginning of this year released their global risk report. And what they put out in the risk report is that we are heading into, according to them, quite a unique environment of a polycrisis where the sum of all crises might exceed or might generate reverberations in the ecosystem never before seen on magnitude. And the report rather reads a doom and gloom, including cost of living crisis, energy crisis, security crisis, cyber, and etc. President Kaljulaid, you are also part of one of the boards at the Munich Security Conference, including your work at the UN. How does the overall environment look to you? Are we stuck in tactics, or we should look at the strategic perspective?
Well, I think that the world has always been in crisis and humankind has always been there. I mean, think about, for example, plague and famine. The only difference was that people were not writing global reports and they didn't know what the other half of the world is doing at that time. So I would not be discouraged. I think these documents are good reminders for us where humankind currently is and what we need to deal with in order to, converge towards a better future, not to miss the important elements which could help us there. But also, of course, there are risks. We have an aggressive neighbor. There is no getting away from that. There are new technologies which grow quicker than our legal space can develop in order to make sure that we all understand how companies could invest safely, how users can use these things safely, and so on, so on. So we have lots of challenges, but I would argue this is normal for the humankind. It's always been like that. Calm down.
Daniel.
Well, look, if there's something that Europeans, unfortunately, are very good at, it's kind of exporting pessimism, right? You know, it's a product that we're really good at developing, packaging up, and sending somewhere. Whereas, Americans on the whole are very good at kind of packaging up optimism and sending it around the world. And I think this is a case of it too. Like the president says, these reports are important. We've got to understand the risks that we're facing. But and it's entirely understandable to say, after COVID, in the context of the first large-scale European war in our lifetimes, there is going to be a lot of problems, not least of what's being passed through in the energy sector and the consequences for the economy as a whole. On top of that, we've had a market correction and a lot of valuations, have collapsed. That is all true. these are all, in my view, tactical issues. This is what's going to happen over the next couple of years. It is not an assessment of where we are strategically, because I think strategically, we, particularly in Europe, are in an incredibly solid place. If you wanted to take investment into a startup 25 years ago in Europe, you'd spend a lot of time trying to find an investor anywhere. You know, if you wanted to get people to work in your startup 25 years ago, unless you were in Tallinn, you were probably going to struggle. And the fact today, Europe, and I count Europe from Norway and the UK, including Turkey, Europe in the broadest sense of the word, is a hotbed of innovation and excitement. You go to any university and you ask students there, what would you like to do? Well, when I started out, they said, I want to go and work at Goldman Sachs or McKinsey. Well, nobody says that today. They all want to build a startup. They want to move to Tallinn, or they want to have the e-residency. So let's not confuse the tactical challenges that we face. As the president says, we've got to understand.
But we have to admit that the first half of the year has been rather extraordinary. I was at South by Southwest at March, and on Wednesday, everything was as always. People were excited, and the next morning, the Silicon Valley Bank crashed. And it seems to be that we are, and the State of European Tech report also shows that in many ways the last year was a record year. But now we are heading into some type of a crash, or at least a challenge in terms of raising capital and keeping the innovation drivers going. Should the founders just go on?
Yeah, I would basically, exactly, if you take up this bank crash, look how calm thereafter what followed has been compared to the last banking crisis. Yet again, you have really clear proof that humankind collectively is able to learn and have far better systems in place. I would say there is only one real crisis which poses a real and serious risk, and that is the war in Ukraine. And I mean, we may have a festive atmosphere here and everything's fine and dandy, but at least 100, probably far more soldiers are dying daily on Ukrainian side. So first and foremost, the only thing which you really, quickly have to get right is to make sure that Ukraine has all the support that it can win. And if then the Russian regime is still the same because they are only fighting for their freedom, not for regime change, then we have to keep lid on that thing. We have North Korea beside of us. There is no use of pretending we don't have North Korea beside us. And if we get that thing right, of which I have serious doubts because so many businesses, instead of coming really out of Russia, have parked their assets. Yes, they have sold, but they have buyback clauses. So there is the only real risk. Everything else, I would say, is an opportunity. Banks occasionally going wrong, overextending, doesn't matter. This is not a risk issue. And the real opportunity issue is that you have more and more of sectors who do things in a startup way. For example, take Estonian energy sector. Energy sector traditionally deals in, big stuff which takes time to construct, and then you have, millions of consumers totally unable to influence the market at all. All this has changed. You don't need behemoths anymore. You can construct virtual power plants in order to manage your peaks. And you know what? Places where big installments really do not happen, I don't know why, but Estonia is one of those places. The startup community, for example, exactly in peak shifting, goes really, really active. We have so many energy startups in this country. And if you look wherever, even boring sectors like construction, you get now the startup thinking. And that, I believe, is really something which we are missing when we are talking about all this doom. Things are actually going in a diversified way, far more diversified way, far more difficult to pinpoint there for the, unicorn babies. But at the same time, there is safety in diversification because this is resilience. This gives you resilience that you have so many ideas of which many will fail. I'm sorry, many of you will fail in next year, but that's fine.
And the thing I would add to that is to say, 10 years ago, if we were going to talk about startups, we were mainly going to talk about consumer-facing, apps, right? And now, as the president says, we're now talking about transformation of the energy market. We're talking about healthcare. We're talking about space. We're talking about much more fundamental and much more difficult places to innovate, but things that are much more important to our societal and human well-being. And that, to me, is also a proof point of the maturity of our ecosystem. Again, I come back, just take a step back and say, if you imagine that in Europe we're probably maybe like 25 tops 15 years into the journey of creating a kind of modern venture-backed technology ecosystem. Okay, let's take any other industry and let's ask ourselves, what did the car industry look like 15 years after they started producing the first cars, right? They didn't look like they look today. Well, we could have stood around and said, well, I'm very upset that the cars aren't flying yet. Well, okay, but it takes time. And 15 years on, the European ecosystem is now, as the president says, providing a challenge across sectors that it just wasn't recently.
So I want to come back to the Ukraine question in a moment again, but at TLD, Eric Byrnofsol, Andy McAfee, very well-known authors of the second machine age, put another doom and gloom scenario, basically said Europe doesn't have any platforms in any other types of capacities. We are lagging behind. We cannot build global AI tech on that scale in order to take over the world. At the same time, a few days ago, Europe put out 122 million for building innovation ecosystems. The EAF has recently launched another 400 million euro for content calls. Horizon Europe at its biggest budgets, and etc. Where can then Europe innovate?
Well, it has gone like that Americans figure everything out, and then Europeans figure it out how it fits and benefits the larger society. Think about GDPR. Many Americans have later adopted it, thinking it's quite a good idea, and have been saying that, yes, indeed, if we look at AI and things like that, we need to have a regulation. Regulation should be light, permissive, and geared towards future generations of technology. So Europe at least is thinking of these things. Does it get things right? No, I don't think it does get things right. Because if you look at, people who are worried about AI developments, then they demand that we will create kind of a supervision system like you have for nuclear energy that will monitor energy use or other ways of, concentrations where you could imagine that there is something going on AI-wise and therefore have an international agreement. We go in and have a look. Then Europe is talking still about data security. So we do have a mismatch. But this is how it has worked. Europe is a big and rich market enough that big companies from other regions take notice if we lead. And you mentioned the billions. Billions are a good thing, but there are more billions in private sector. And also in Europe even, there are more billions in private sector. Also, I know, unfortunately, really well European throughput systems for this money. And it will be cumbersome, and it will not be fast enough. So if I were president of the European Commission, I would concentrate on legal environment innovation rather than putting my money into policy. But politicians do it regularly, that if they don't know how to create a framework, then they put money in instead. It just seems like a reasonable replacement. But it might help, of course. If they put their own skin in the game, they will have lots of companies where they have their own money. And if it's not a grant money, but loan money, I hope it will be revolving grants. So then that would mean that they have to legislate in order to allow their own investments to thrive in this environment.
So I would like to follow up. What do we need to tear down to rebuild, if a little bit paraphrase the Lennart Meri security conference a few weeks ago?
Yeah, but there the problem was somebody else had torn it down. Here we do not have this problem. So I think we have sound foundations. We have clear understanding where are American advantages, where are European advantages, and where are Chinese risks. And then, we can navigate this ecosystem very well, with Europe leading in thinking socially, America leading in thinking in innovation. But there is one thing. Americans have IRA. And TTIP is a rude word. In fact, we need more TTIPs and less IRAs in order to make these two kind of poles to work together and really unleash all the benefits for the free world.
Agreed.
Daniel, you founded Publix. Publix is quite a unique organization that brings together high-capacity startup entrepreneurs together with the public sector, exactly with the goal to innovate with health, with energy, with other verticals, etc. Why, how, and what are the success stories?
Well, 7 years into this journey, and I should pay tribute to my co-founder who joined you on stage yesterday, as well, Alex de Carvalho. 7 years into this journey, this is a question we often ask ourselves because the idea of bringing kind of innovation to some of the most entrenched markets in the public sector is hard. And it speaks a little bit to the question you were asking, what is it we have to tear down? I don't want to say we have to tear down our public administrations, but I think we have to be honest with ourselves that we built those public administrations for a different era. And the way in which we train civil servants, and I'd also argue politicians, the way we create incentives inside our public organizations, whether ministries or agencies, militates against early, fast, inquisitive adoption of new methods. Now, if you want to be a diplomat in a country, you often have to learn foreign languages. And foreign ministries are really good at teaching people, their diplomats, foreign languages. Why? Because they know what matters. So they send a French speaker to France, a German speaker to Germany, and so on, right? Today, wherever you are, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Defense, the language you need to speak is technology. It's technology more broadly. Where AI, first you need like some basic data systems and some rails and so on, and then AI. But you need to speak technology. What are we doing to ensure that those people who work in those administrations have the same facility with technology as they might have with like accounting?
We in Estonia have always had an answer to that.
Go.
Because in Estonia, labor market is free for all. You can work in private, work in public sector, switch between the two, losing nothing out of your healthcare or pension plans. And that is why Estonia has been so successful in this, digital 1.0 or even 0.0, if you think it's
and that is a wonderful example for others to follow. I just think we have to be honest that across Europe, we're not doing what the Estonians are doing here, right? Today, the German army recruits its 100,000 employees on paper, right? No digital process whatsoever. There are countless other examples. And if we want to succeed in bringing technology, as the president says, to some of these really entrenched but very potentially fruitful sectors, then we've got to change the mindset of those who are sitting on the other side and are deciding or buying and so on. So my first point, what have I learned over the last couple of years of trying to get technology to attack some of these entrenched sectors is, at the end of the day, we have to go on a journey to help the buyers understand what good looks like and what bad looks like. And the second thing I'd say is our procurement systems are built for a totally different era, right? They're built for, I'm going to go and buy a large physical object. This physical object is either, on the shelf and I can see it and I'm going to buy it, or in the case of a tank, it'll take 10 years to develop and we can sort of go slowly through the process. Can I just finish the point, which is to say, today when you're buying technology, innovation is fast like this. So of course a procurement system that locks in a number of vendors for 5 years assumes that nothing's going to happen in those 5 years when something in truth happens every 5 minutes. So my second point would be, what I've learned is we've got to change the way that states and regulators buy things in order to innovate more.
So, yes.
Yeah, my understanding is therefore that you are telling that instead of, for example, buying a new digitalized healthcare model where doctors and nurses and patients can change information, we should instead right now be procuring in the Ministry of Social Affairs kind of AI-related healthcare model where you have, diagnosis by AI, operations by doctors in distance, and so on, so on. And this is kind of an inherent mismatch because, I can tell you, and you know it, nobody can procure what we actually cannot describe, and we cannot describe AI in 10 years' time. And this is the most interesting dilemma of our time. And I don't think it's a problem. It's just something which we need to recognize and understand that something has to give. And best if red tape gives, of course. I don't know whether it will, but it should.
Yeah. So just a few weeks ago, I was in Italy in a conference, and I tried to log into ChatGPT, and to my great surprise, it was banned. We are in a situation where not only NLPs are growing by 100 millions within a month, but indeed we do have this paradox. The leader of Future Life organization, Yuval Noah Harari, said only a few days ago that AI is rewriting our humanity. What are your takes? on the risks and opportunities here.
The ban was lifted, which demonstrates once more that democracies always do the right thing, but only after they've tried every wrong thing. And this is just, I mean, the shortest and quickest example of that, which again demonstrates that public sector is getting flexible. Previously, it would have taken 5 years to lift that ban. Now it took a month.
Totally right. Look, I don't want to dismiss the concerns, but let's go back in time, right? Professor Jerry Oppenheimer was probably one of the most important contributors to the creation of the nuclear bomb. And after he helped create the nuclear bomb, he, as some of you may know, and a new film is coming out shortly about his life, he became incredibly frightened about what he'd created and started warning against nuclear weapons and believed fundamentally that within 5 years, all of humanity would die because we couldn't control this terrible weapon that we had developed. Well, he wasn't right. Here we all are, and while of course we recognize that there are risks, and we have, as the president says, regimes to manage military and civilian, nuclear weapons, humankind, has shown an incredible ability to manage even the most complex things. So I start from a position of optimism about humankind's ability to manage the most complex things, and that's why I'm not, I'm not quaking in my boots. I'm cognizant of the problems, and no doubt we'll talk about those. But my starting point is, let's think about all the other terrible, destructive technologies that we developed and how well we have managed them over many years.
But clearly there is an American model, there is a Chinese model, let's say Team Red, Team Blue, and then what exactly is the European or our model, especially if you look at AI? Is it on open source? Is it on building capacity in a certain type of an area, education, so forth?
I don't agree that these three models, I think these are tactical models. Strategic model is still the same, and if you look what Constructive Destruction Lab in Toronto is writing, I mean, then they are reminding us all that technologies have a way to ingrow into economy. Electricity took 40 years. And I mean, until you had new kind of business models and new production models, which from the beginning were designed thinking that they have electricity, you got the production, rise really. You didn't get it when you were innovating at the points, replacing one steam engine with one electrical one. This didn't help at all. Same with internet. I mean, initially you had kind of point use, then you will have flow use. And this is now also the universal strategic issue is that AI currently is not yet rising our productivity radically because we have no or very few business processes. I would think maybe our Bolt in Estonia, for example, is one of those who are locally really taking into account in their business process design already AI opportunities. But there are very few examples. So all this productivity rise is to come. As they call it in Toronto, they call it the in-between time. And we are right now strategically in the in-between time. And what you are talking, Chinese, Americans, Europeans, this is our tactical ways of managing this in-between time. And frankly speaking, many think Chinese may have an advantage because they control how things are going. I say they don't have an advantage because in a controlled environment, people are not truly free to innovate, and only, truly free innovators bring really radical change. So I think one of those European or American models will actually function better. But on the other hand, since we do not know, the kaleidoscope turns, and then it becomes very obvious that one didn't function. And we would say, how amazing. Think about one fact. Very simple fact, when AI came, ChatGPT-4 now came, it used to be a funny artifact that Estonians are many times overrepresented, I think about 2 magnitudes, overrepresented online by Estonian language texts. It was a fun fact. Now it is a vital element of survival for a small language and culture space. This way it could go also. So we need many models. We do not have a common model which will help. We need many models. Someone will, turn out to function in this climate.
Daniel.
A couple of points here, but some very thoughtful interventions by the president. But a couple of points from me. First of all, 2 of the most important people at OpenAI. One is a Polish IT specialist, and another is an Albanian-born technologist, right? They are, I think, CTO and deputy CTO at OpenAI, right? And why am I mentioning that? Because we have no dearth of talent in Europe, right? we have the kind of talent that can create the sort of cutting edge. The question is, to what extent can we give the framework, the rules, the capital, the market for that talent to get the kind of investment they need to build here? And so whenever we start talking about kind of AI in Europe and Europe's role, there is an important conversation about regulations and the way we organize our society, but I want to start somewhere else, which is if there are no truly breakthrough AI companies in Europe, then all we're talking about is regulating everybody else's company. So we have to create an ecosystem on this landmass.
By the founders here.
By founders like you, and thankfully there are really great companies. Aleph Alpha in Germany is one example, but there are many others. There are great companies that are really, able to compete with, OpenAI and others, and more will emerge over the coming years. So kind of my first point to every European policymaker that talks about AI, and the moment they've said the words AI, they say, let me talk to you about regulation, is like, let's talk about something first, which is, who is it that you'd like to regulate, and can we make sure that we've got some of those in Europe? Then, let's talk about what is the right, framework, and on that point, I actually think that, and I think the President, you were making a similar point, I think the Italian example, which was castigated and laughed at, I actually think it's a really great example, because it does show, as you say, the regulator is, it is on it, doesn't know what to do, but also wants to flex, takes a step back, it wants to have a dialogue, figure things out. That's okay. What we have seen in the past is what happens when you don't do that at all. And let me just give you a tiny example, which is, I think that the arrival of ride-sharing apps has been incredibly beneficial to consumers, but it's also the case that they arrived in Europe and in many cases created a lot of challenges for cities that just weren't in any way ready for this arrival. So I think we've got to take responsibility. The future of AI isn't something that's happening out there that we can't influence. It's something all of us have to kind of want to influence, and regulators have to play an important role in that. But go back to where I started. What is it you want to regulate? And if you want something to regulate that isn't Chinese or American, what are you doing to create the conditions for that?
So grow, then regulate.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Grow and then think about it.
Yeah, but I really agree with you that, in fact, what Italians were doing, think also, they're the European country which were hardest hit by the COVID first. So they just were pulling up their masks for a second, realizing there is no real danger, and the mask comes off. It was exactly the same, and I think that is the reason why Italians were so quick to react. Also, I do agree that Europe could have more talent, but in fact, European talent very often finds it easier to go and grow their business elsewhere. And part of it is because, they are more trustful of the global environment, not to try to regulate their gains and their business opportunity away. And there is an elephant which is not in the room, but which is global. And the elephant is, we currently have totally unregulated global service delivery market. And I hope it is not too big for anybody to decide to regulate it. But it doesn't distribute the gains equally, because people from African countries working in European countries, living in African countries, cannot share the gains or do not have to share the gains, because the tax boards have no model on how to, therefore, share these social gains. And it is a problem, because we are sitting in industrial age, thinking of our work, thinking of our social support schemes. And they should turn global. If I'm an Estonian citizen, I want to treat my government as a safe dock, which provides me with education services, healthcare services everywhere and globally. And if I work for Australian government, I want to share my gains from there with my country to be sure that the redistributional systems like education and healthcare stay functional in my country. And we actually should try to do a little bit kind of clean slate thinking in this context. Like, for example, closer to our hearts, maybe, you are not from Tallinn, we are. I don't know how it looks in London, but Tallinn looks like, every street right now is dug up. So we cannot move in Tallinn. So if I were someone who is responsible to guarantee some mobility for Tallinn citizens, a year ago, I would have called Markus Villig and asked, Markus, come in to city government and we will procure from you Initially, for a probative period, for the 2 years when, every street in Tallinn will be dug up, a city mobility system and platform which will allow citizens of Tallinn to move around. We don't mind where you use buses, trains, scooters, whatever. Just tell us, based on your data flows, what we should be offering our citizens. This is how we should be doing modern day regulation.
Daniel, innovating mobility is very close to your mission at London as well, if that goes through.
No, absolutely. And I appreciate many of you here won't be following the ins and outs of London politics. But 3 days ago, I caused quite a stir in London by, as the headline said, he wants to get rid of all the red lights, all the red traffic lights. Actually, what I said was, why don't we use technology and sensors to understand where in the middle of the night you need the red light on when there's no traffic anywhere, instead of having lots of cars standing idle with the engines running with lots of CO2 emissions. Why don't we just use technology so that the light can anticipate when you're there? Of course, the effect is to get rid of red light. The reality is, I'm not proposing to switch off the red light, but I'm proposing the technology, and pretty rudimentary technology, which is already in the market in lots of places, could be applied. That caused like a whole stir, and I think it's a great example that in places like Tallinn and events like Latitude59 on stages like this, we're very comfortable with how technology can improve our lives. For a lot of ordinary people, it's still something newfangled, and even though they have it on their phones, they haven't really thought about the fact that it will influence their healthcare and their traffic. And I think we all have a role, those of us who are very positive and confident about the role of technology. We have a role in kind of explaining and making people feel comfortable with what can happen.
So talking about technologies, and we are quite short of the time, what are the most exciting technologies or solutions or future visions that you are looking forward to?
I am right now quite optimistic about how much predictive technologies, and most of us think of LLMs, but predictive technologies do work also to create new components for example, medicines. They will allow us to predict far better which kind of components will work for which diseases, personalized medicines for very, high variety of cancers, for example, combined with the vaccine system, which was mRNA vaccines, which was developed during the COVID pandemic with these predictive machines. I think there are huge gains for the future healthcare, and not only, making people healthy when they have fallen ill, but also keeping them healthy. And this is something which is massive if we can get it right. And it must not turn into a privilege for a few, because these technologies, to become affordable, actually need a mass. They really cannot be sustained by 1% of the richest of this world, and this would also not be fair. So for me, this is extremely, extremely interesting. And the second thing is, how do AI get mainstreamed into the new processes? Who is today building a factory and is not thinking how this process radically needs to change from the factory built 5 years ago? They are already down the drain. So these two things for me.
Daniel.
I guess I'm really excited about how basic things around us, materials, biology, food, is now being transformed, right? We have basically been adding things to stuff that was either growing or living around us. That's kind of what our food has become, right? Back in the olden days, you either picked it or it was in your stable, and then you killed it and ate it, or chopped it and ate it, right? And then what happened over 6 years, we added stuff to it. But we didn't really change the nature of what we were dealing with. And that is now beginning to happen. Food is emerging that has no relationship. We're making beef out of mushrooms. Now, we're at an early stage of that, but it is a really exciting development. And
vertical farms for London.
Well, vertical farms for London is something I've argued for, but that's in a way not as in innovative. I'm talking about the way that the things around us is becoming transformed. Today we're in a very big old concrete factory. Concrete production is one of the worst things for the environment, right? You've got to burn a lot of things in a kiln. But today, biomass is an ability to create cement out of the same process that coral reefs use to replicate themselves. So in future, we have the ability to create a whole different kind of cement and address a huge problem for CO2 emissions. And that's really what I'm very excited about. The fact that the material world around us that we in many ways have taken for granted and added to, we now increasingly have the ability, with, of course, risks too, of changing it, and that's very exciting.
We have 1 minute. If you would have a chance to, or you have a chance to inspire the founders, the financiers, the officials here, what would be your single recommendation?
Well, it's not a recommendation, it's just a statement of a matter of life. And this is the ability of economy to adapt is always overcoming the regulatory difficulties of this kind of adaptation. Economy always wins, and this is what always has been true. It can be bad. For example, economy always finds a way around the sanctions against Russia. We should keep an eye on that. But on the other hand, economic progress always, makes finally regulators to go with them.
I guess I'd say, first, start now. If you're sitting in this audience and you're like, I've got this startup idea, but I'm not quite sure, and I've got to speak to this person, don't forget it. Start now. Second, run fast. The world respects speed. Run fast. Start now, run fast. And the final thing is, General Colin Powell, the former chief of defense in the US, wrote brilliantly in his autobiography, optimism, he said, is the greatest force multiplier. Be optimistic. It'll help you, it'll help everybody around you. Start now, run fast, and be optimistic.
Thank you, President Kaljulaid. Thank you, Daniel Korski.